In 2012, a hospital pharmacist in Canada noticed something unusual about a batch of the chemotherapy drug Avastin it had received through its normal supply chain. The vials looked correct. The packaging looked correct. The documentation was in order. But the drug inside was not Avastin. It contained no bevacizumab, the active compound in Avastin, a monoclonal antibody that inhibits the growth of blood vessels supplying tumors. It contained salt and starch. The hospital had purchased fake cancer medication through a supply chain it had every reason to trust, for patients whose lives depended on the treatment being real. This was not an isolated event. It was a discovery, one of many, within a global criminal industry whose scale, sophistication, and lethality have grown in direct proportion to the value and complexity of the pharmaceutical market it has learned to exploit. The economics that make pharmaceutical counterfeiting attractive are straightforward and disturbing. Cancer drugs are among the most expensive pharmaceutical products ever manufactured. A course of treatment with a modern targeted therapy or immunotherapy agent can cost tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars per patient. This price reflects the genuine cost of research and development, the decade or more and the billions of dollars required to bring a new cancer drug through clinical trials. But it also creates a price point at which the profit available from selling a convincing fake is enormous. The raw materials required to produce a convincing counterfeit of a cancer drug are, in many cases, cheap. Salt water, glucose solution, and simple starch or talc, placed in a correctly labeled and correctly packaged vial, cost a fraction of a % of the price that vial will command in the legitimate pharmaceutical market. The margin available to a criminal operation producing and selling fake cancer drugs is, on a per-unit basis, among the highest in any illicit market. The operational model varies. At the most sophisticated end, criminal networks manufacture products that are physically indistinguishable from legitimate drugs. Correct vials, correct closures, correct labels with correct lot numbers and expiration dates, correct holograms and security features. These are not garage operations. They require industrial equipment, graphic design capability, security feature replication technology, and distribution networks capable of inserting product into legitimate supply chains. At the less sophisticated end, counterfeit drugs with obvious quality defects, incorrect appearance, visible particulates, damaged packaging, circulate primarily in markets with less rigorous inspection infrastructure. Sub-Saharan Africa and parts of South and Southeast Asia have historically been the most heavily targeted regions for lower-quality counterfeits, with anti-malarial drugs, antibiotics, and in more recent years, cancer medications among the most commonly counterfeited products. The supply chain insertion problem, how counterfeit drugs enter legitimate pharmaceutical distribution, is the central challenge for enforcement agencies and for hospitals and pharmacies trying to protect their patients. The pharmaceutical supply chain for high-value branded drugs typically involves the manufacturer, a network of authorized distributors, and then pharmacies or hospitals. This chain is, in principle, regulated and documented at every step. In practice, the chain is often more complex than this description suggests. Gray market trading, parallel importing across national borders where price differentials make arbitrage profitable, and the involvement of multiple intermediary distributors all create points at which the chain becomes harder to verify. In the United States, the Drug Supply Chain Security Act of 2013 established requirements for track and trace documentation along the pharmaceutical supply chain, a system intended to make it possible to verify the origin of any dispensed drug. Back through its distribution history, implementation of the full system has been phased in over a decade and is still not complete for all segments of the supply chain. Outside the United States and the European Union, supply chain security requirements are highly variable. In many countries, the infrastructure for verifying the authenticity of pharmaceutical products is limited. Pharmacies in low-income countries may receive drugs from multiple sources, with documentation that is difficult or impossible to independently verify. The Internet has created an additional vector: online pharmacies, many of which operate entirely outside regulatory frameworks, sell cancer drugs, and other high-value pharmaceuticals at prices that attract price-sensitive consumers and that are often funded by counterfeit product. The medical consequences for patients who receive counterfeit cancer medication range from the absence of benefit to active harm. A patient receiving fake Avastin, or a fake version of any targeted cancer therapy, is receiving no treatment for their disease. If the counterfeiting is undetected and the patient's cancer progresses during a period in which they believe they are receiving effective treatment, diagnostic and treatment decisions made on the assumption of efficacy are wrong. Clinicians may interpret disease progression as treatment failure with real drugs and move to more aggressive or different protocols, when in fact the initial drug was never present. The window for potentially effective alternative treatments may close. Some counterfeits contain not merely inactive ingredients but harmful ones. Vials produced in uncontrolled manufacturing conditions may be contaminated with bacteria or particulates. Some counterfeit products have contained incorrect compounds, drugs with their own pharmacological effects, potentially dangerous ones. They're present only because they were cheap filler or because the counterfeiters were producing multiple products in shared facilities with inadequate cleaning protocols. The harm is not theoretical. Cases in which patients have been documented to have received counterfeit cancer medication and suffered identifiable harm have been documented in the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, Germany, and across developing countries. The total number of patients affected globally is unknown. The counterfeit that is never detected is, by definition, not counted. Enforcement against pharmaceutical counterfeiting involves a challenging jurisdictional matrix. Criminal networks producing counterfeit cancer drugs typically operate manufacturing in one country, print labels using designers in another, assemble final product in a third, and distribute through brokers in multiple additional countries. Investigators from any single national authority can pursue the fraction of the network in their jurisdiction, but coordinated international action is required to dismantle the entire operation. Interpol coordinates international pharmaceutical crime enforcement through its Interpol Pharmaceutical Crime Unit. Operations such as Pangea, an annual coordinated international enforcement action focused on online pharmaceutical crime, have resulted in seizures of tens of millions of counterfeit and substandard medical products and hundreds of arrests in each iteration. The scale of the operations disrupted by these actions, while significant, represents a small fraction of the overall market. The pharmaceutical industry itself invests heavily in anti-counterfeiting technology, holograms, serialization, chemical fingerprinting of the active compound, spectroscopic authentication tools. But these technologies are only protective when the inspection infrastructure exists to use them. A hospital pharmacist with a handheld spectroscopic device can verify the chemical composition of a drug in seconds. Most hospitals in most countries do not have these devices. The counterfeit pharmaceutical market is, at its core, a criminal enterprise that operates on the same economics as any sophisticated fraud. It sells something that looks like a valuable product at a high price, at a cost far below the product apparent value, relying on the buyer's inability to distinguish the fake from real. The difference between pharmaceutical fraud and most other fraud is the specific nature of the victim's vulnerability. The patient with cancer who receives a course of fake chemotherapy is not just losing money. They're losing time during which their disease is progressing, time during which their body is being weakened by stress and illness, time that cannot be recovered. They may be losing the treatment window entirely. The criminal networks doing this are not targeting an abstraction. They are targeting specific individual people at the worst moments of their lives, extracting the maximum possible value from those moments, and leaving in exchange the worst possible thing a medical transaction can deliver: nothing.